Hi, everyone. We are here with our first introductory episode of Soul, Cosmos, and Consciousness. And I'm really excited to introduce ourselves to you and to let you know a little bit more about what we'll be doing in the future. So, this podcast, Soul, Cosmos, and Consciousness, is part of a new media series that is designed by my guest, Dr. Christophe Morin, and me together to illuminate your understanding and to bring more consciousness into your life to feed your soul. So that includes also articles, what we're calling soul posts. And also it includes this podcast series, as well as some free events and other exciting topics and opportunities for you to explore. So for today, I'd like to introduce you to my guest, Dr. Christophe Morin. We are going to be interviewing each other for these first two episodes so that you can get to know us a little bit. And then from there, we will be bringing in guests on a fairly regular basis for our exploration of all these various different topics that we're interested in. So first of all, Christophe, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it was a mutual decision, obviously, as I just mentioned. But maybe you can start us out by telling us a little bit about your background and also what brought you to your interest in consciousness.
Of course. So I've been a marketing researcher most of my career, but decided to turn to neuroscience because I never felt that my ability to explore why people purchase what they purchase, why they pay attention to certain ads, by just talking to them. And I realized that so much of the so-called consumer behavior was unconscious. Therefore, by definition, most of the people I would interview really couldn't get into the why. So I decided to pursue a PhD in media psychology with an emphasis in neuropsychology. And I have, for the last 20 years, published extensively in this field called neuromarketing, which is bridging neuroscience with marketing. And I tell you this bit because though it has very little to do with research on consciousness, I would not be able to explore as much as I wanted to the science behind consciousness and neuroplasticity if I hadn't spent a couple of decades poking at the brain, learning all kinds of clinical methods through which I can examine brain activity. And so I leveraged all this knowledge, this passion that I have for brain science into this new endeavor of cracking the code of consciousness. Not exactly the simplest problem to solve. It's, of course, often described as the hard problem, but it is part of what I think I bring to that equation, and that is this kind of polymathic experience of multiple fields into fields that I think are becoming very, very essential to bring into the conversation of both consciousness and spirituality.
Yeah, well, that's very exciting. And I know that you have written, you mentioned you've written extensively on this. And in fact, you have recently published what I think is a really groundbreaking new book. It's called Open, a Neurospiritual Exploration of the Self-Healing Power of Your Brain. So I know in that book, you talk about a framework that you have established to be able to really start looking from a neurospiritual approach. So maybe you can start by sharing with us what that framework is and why it's so important as you see it for personal transformation.
Of course. So I was for a long time what I would describe as a materialist scientist. And what that means is I believed in the scientific framework for explaining anything. At the same time, I didn't realize that adopting this very reductive view of science turned me away from any possible conversation or exploration on what is commonly referred as soul psychology or spirituality. And it's really through my own personal journey into addressing a lot of issues around stress, anxiety, and depression that I recognize that in order to really fully embrace the complexity of that topic, which goes far beyond just the materialistic view, I really had to open up to the possibilities that what may not be easily scientifically explain is still real, is still a part of what I wanted to really learn and selfishly apply to my own healing. And so the book, as you know, is very personal. About a third of the book is really about my own struggles, my own wins, victories, if you will, over what you would call most likely very severe and sometimes very toxic conditions. I mean, stress and anxiety and depression at a certain level really become very, very difficult to live with. And it's through that desire to crack and ultimately solve many of those problems that I finally open up to this notion that spiritual states are indeed partially probably supported by the brain, but there's way more to that equation, if you will, than just neuroscience. And that is what I decided to break through and unpack in ways that go far beyond the materialistic science.
Well, this, of course, is one of the reasons that I'm so excited to co-host this podcast with you as we explore more of the framework of consciousness and also, of course, my main topic of interest, which is soul-centered psychologies. And, it's a pretty big leap from being a materialistic scientist all the way to spirituality. And that is not something that everybody would find obvious. But at the same time, in my work, what I understand is that soul or a relationship with something that we might call the spiritual or the sacred is in fact what makes meaning in our lives. And so it doesn't surprise me at all to know that your path has led you from that materialistic position to this idea of consciousness and something of a higher, whatever you want to call it, I guess, a higher power or something bigger than us, something bigger than our usual ego selves that is driving us around our daily lives. So I'm really excited about the progression in your book, and I'd like to know about some of the main tenets, if you're willing. So first of all, I know that you have a huge focus on neuroplasticity. And of course, you mentioned that you were struggling yourself with things like stress and anxiety and depression. And I would volunteer from my perspective and the coaching work that I do with people, soul-centered coaching, that pretty much everybody on this planet has some form of stress, anxiety, or depression. I cannot imagine that anybody can avoid that because I think it's the human condition. I think it's something that we have fallen into in many ways because of our ego self and the coping mechanisms that we have had to develop due to whatever traumas, small or large, that we might have experienced in our own early lives or later lives. Sometimes that contributes to it too. But you have landed on this idea of neuroplasticity as being one of the really powerful perspectives that you can take to address things like stress, anxiety, and depression, and also maybe early childhood trauma of all sorts, whether it's acute or developmental. So maybe you can speak to how the brain's neuroplasticity actually relates to us overcoming that stress or anxiety and depression.
Of course. So for all of the people that may not be familiar with the term neuroplasticity, it really speaks to properties that our brain has to repair or heal our body. And I make the difference between the two because repair could be as simple as, a broken bone that seems to be magically fixing itself, or skin that was just cut that seems to close on its own. So we are all very familiar with these really remarkable properties of how the brain can repair our body. But most of us have very little understanding of how neuroplasticity can also be going as far as rewiring certain pathways that are responsible for our behavior, but also for many of our maladaptive behaviors. So in the study of mental health, we call maladaptive patterns of behaviors that simply do not serve us. And it turns out, as you well know, that many people, millions of people, really do carry those patterns of behaviors. And I discovered that many of those patterns of behaviors could actually be rewritten. Now, it sounds like you're just opening the brain and redoing the story. What it takes is really certain understanding of how that rewriting process works, and especially the first step of making that neuroplasticity kick in is to raise your consciousness. And so both of those terms, as you know in the book, are intertwined constantly to explain to readers that it is through this journey of learning what consciousness is, its responsibility and its power in giving us those additional insights into the root causes of these maladaptive behavior. But we don't stop at that point. We actually can engage in specific rituals. Sometimes those rituals are indeed colored by a certain spiritual, religious aspect. But by and large, we have the ability to identify, and this is what I do in the book, certain behaviors and ways to dialogue, if you will, internally with our brain to completely rewrite and eliminate a lot of those maladaptive behaviors.
Yeah, well, it's really super powerful because it kind of gives us a roadmap toward being able to not only identify those areas in our lives where we are challenged. And, I have to say, not everybody actually is very aware necessarily when they are suffering from things like depression or anxiety. I mean, obviously, sometimes the physical symptoms are manifesting themselves and it's obvious, but sometimes our brains are really powerful and so are our egos. And I know from my work that often what we will do is repress or suppress some of those experiences or some of that emotional content that's really troubling for us, some of the things that have happened to us or that we have experienced or had to go through because of our environment or because of certain experiences that we've had. And when it's just not pleasant to be able to go through those kinds of experiences, we just have this natural capacity as human beings to be able to suppress or repress it. So I'm wondering maybe now if we could move more into, first of all, what is your definition of consciousness? And then what is your definition of spirituality? Because obviously both of these, as you mentioned, are intertwined throughout the book, but it would be really helpful, I think, for us to talk about the role that they each play, but starting with a definition.
Yes, absolutely. To your point earlier on the presence of these, what we see as maladaptive behaviors, in the Western world, we tend to look at those behaviors as maladies, as sickness. And for the longest time, I assumed that the only way to address these particular issues was through prescription drugs or ways to fix me or fix my brain, until I realized that in more Eastern traditions and other ways to think about these maladaptive behaviors, they see disease, they see stress, depression as messages from our soul, as messages that really communicate that there is a problem that should be addressed. And of course, what I'm describing here is to actually learn that language and tune into that language, which is really the role of consciousness. So consciousness is this property, of course, very, very complex, that we all have to experience a moment, if you will. Sometimes it could be an elongated amount of time during which we can observe our behaviors. And if we are fully connected and aware and present to these moments, we can describe the richness of these moments and really elevate our understanding of what's going on beyond what the ego would ultimately assume. It's not just an event that we can just brush off. It's actually an opportunity to soak in all these messages that we have the capacity to connect with, and messages that do expand our awareness and our capacity to diagnose and assess the degree to which these maladaptive behaviors really should be addressed differently than through conventional Western medicine. Now, let's be clear, I'm not against prescription drugs, but as you said, it's kind of like repression. You're just putting into a little box, you're assuming the medicine alone is going to do its work, when in fact, so much of that self-healing property that our brain has does require for us to be active in that process, not passive in the process. So consciousness is often described as a spectrum of energy. We're not quite sure, where it comes from. Materialistic scientists continue to believe, though they really don't have the evidence, that consciousness is indeed a function of our neurons, and the way the neurons fire ultimately produce this thing we call consciousness. The reason it's not satisfactory is because we cannot see from the individual nature of each neuron the properties that create what's called an emergent process called consciousness. So there's a really vibrant conversation now about what it is that we can do to go beyond what the brain is telling us is consciousness, not necessarily deny it, but certainly add layers of understanding that come from, especially, the spiritual aspect of our experience. Now, you invited me to describe spirituality, so maybe I can do it next, unless you want to add a comment on my interpretation or definition of consciousness.
Well, I really appreciate what you have said about consciousness, and maybe I will just add sort of a clarification from my perspective. And that is that we talk about consciousness, we might use it interchangeably with awareness, but we might actually look at spirituality, which I know you're going there next, as higher consciousness, as awareness, but awareness of things that are beyond what the ego is normally aware of. So if it's not the ego that is aware of something, then what is it? And of course, in my work, again, I would talk about that as the soul. You had mentioned that, and all of these ancient wisdom traditions that we have access to now, particularly through the global connectivity that we have through internet and now AI and all kinds of new sources to understand and learn things about this, we are able to understand that our ancestors and or people that were living from thousands of years ago knew things about this, and probably arguably did not have the same amount of stress, anxiety, and depression that we see in our world today, because partially because we are so interconnected. We can see real footage of wars that are going on around the world from us, and yet still feel like it's part of our own life, still feel like almost like we are experiencing that. And so it's really easy, I have found among my clients and even also myself, that we get caught up very easily in this information, and it really does manage to drag us down a lot of the time. And so we have to have consciousness about what we are feeding into our minds and about what we are taking in order to be able to start identifying if we are being affected by it, or how we are being affected by it, I should say. So with that in mind, I would love to go on to your definition of spirituality.
Yeah, you bring really an excellent point, and that is how we've become sponges of events that our brain can't make sense of. And this mechanism is an aspect of what I've been studying with the effect of media, content of all sort, whether it's news or movies or commercial. They all have a tremendous impact on our brain, because it turns out that we have very specific neurons called mirror neurons, which purpose is to mirror and sample the scenes or stories that we find ourselves pulled into. And so that process, which is designed to help us learn and engage, is in fact part of the root cause of how much we end up packing, if you will, stress, anxiety from the visual, especially, interaction with media content. Of course, through social media and proliferation of mobile phones, we do have to recognize the volume of information that we cannot discern or filter very easily. And so the stressors that come from that are enormous. And what I discovered is really the capacity that we have to protect ourselves comes with the urgency of raising our consciousness. And at the same time, I realized that consciousness alone may not be the answer. We have to recognize the varying states of consciousness that limit our ability to see what we need to see, to rewire and rewrite our stories and our patterns of maladaptive behavior. So the entry for me in spirituality was to recognize that there are states, sometimes called non-ordinary states of consciousness. Many of them are, in fact, considered spiritual states, for instance, prayer or meditation. But there are also, of course, other types of states that do put us in certain non-ordinary state of consciousness. Breath work, for instance, the work that I have done, and I know you have as well, with Stan Grof and holotropic breath work has totally opened my mind to the possibility that we have more than what I would call regular consciousness, and a portal through which we can really begin to understand why these maladaptive behaviors seem to live in us, and why, more importantly, we can, through the portal of spiritual experiences, eliminate them. And so I never recognized until I, burst the ceiling of that materialism. I never realized these states of awareness or consciousness, first of all, could be induced, could be created by experiences, by rituals, and that these opportunities were given to us, I truly believe, to not just raise our consciousness, but to ultimately see the path to self-healing using neuroplasticity.
Yeah, it's so important because I think what you're talking about here is expanding our understanding or gaining that wisdom through other ways of knowing besides just our brain, besides just thinking about something or reading about something. I mean, that can only take you so far, but I know from my experience that we cannot really learn or experience something unless we have a felt sense of something. That felt sense is something that really touches us through our somatic sense, our bodies, that we have the capacity to have a felt experience of something that speaks a certain truth to us, that resonates with a truth that is important for us. And so I can see that leap from the materialistic science where it says, the brain has an answer for everything, or we can find out by putting a lot of thinking power into it, to this leap to these kinds of practices that you're mentioning that allow us to almost like, to use a word that might be not scientifically approved for this specific situation, but to almost download this new knowledge or understanding that we have to have in order to be able to begin to build a framework around those maladaptive behaviors, to begin to understand why do we have those? Well, first of all, to begin to understand that we have them at all. And a lot of those we developed very, very early in our young lives, and we didn't question it because we didn't really have the language or the brain power to be able to question it at the time. And then fast forward several decades, and we're still using a lot of those same coping mechanisms completely automatically, and most people don't even realize it. So if you find yourself, for example, in an argument with your partner or your spouse, what is causing that? There's always going to be a reason. It's not necessarily, who rolled the toothpaste the wrong way, right? Often it's going to be something that goes back to a very deep wounding or an experience that was very traumatic when we were very young, something that made us feel unsafe, perhaps, or something that made us feel like we weren't going to be accepted by a caregiver. And of course, that's critical, because if we're not accepted by a caregiver, who is going to put food on the table for us? And we know that somehow as young kids, even though we can't think about it. Or maybe there's something where, mom just says no, and we take that as an absolute rejection. And it contributes to our sense of, wow, I don't belong here. I don't belong in this house. Look, she just gave my brother something, and now I'm asking for it, and she's saying no. So I guess I don't belong here. There's something wrong with me. And you can see how we just go down those patterns. And so these practices that you are bringing up here, and I know you list many of them in the book, and I don't know if you'll want to say more about that or if we have the time, but these practices actually allow us then to get in touch with that something bigger, whether you want to call it the universe or God or the Great Spirit or higher consciousness, whatever you want to call it. Soul is my word of choice, obviously. But it gives us the opportunity to be able then to identify what those maladaptive behaviors are, what those coping mechanisms are, and then we can be able to actually get some white space between those behaviors as they come along, and we can see what's happening, and then we get to make a decision. If we can just get a little bit of space in between those automatic behaviors, then we can make a decision. Do I want to continue this, or do I not? So where can we go with this?
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. The neurospiritual idea is, obviously, by now you should be able to understand it, is to bring obviously good science on what we understand are these toxic patterns that ultimately send these kinds of neurochemicals, hormones, neurotransmitters that do represent toxicity and ultimately reduce our consciousness and reduce our neuroplasticity. So it's really, really important to understand that the presence of these behaviors is destructive to our health. So stepping up and recognize that will take, for instance, as you mentioned, exploring patterns of your character, traits, coping mechanism. And as you and I have long explored, good models of personality, trait, character, like Enneagram, are really extraordinarily valuable systems. They're tools, but they point to the why behind certain maladaptive behavior. So the first step of open is really to create what I call meta consciousness, which is the idea of going above traditional consciousness and really start in a most open way that you can to accept that there are certain coping mechanisms or traits that just don't serve us. Once we've been able to do that, then we can move into the identification of modalities. I call them rituals because I truly believe in the power of repeating certain modalities and do so with the idea of raising consciousness and ultimately creating what are called opportunities for neuroplasticity. And this process of linking consciousness and neuroplasticity has been further explored, of course, during what we call now the psychedelic renaissance. Understanding psychedelics and their effect on the brain has really helped a lot of researchers, such as myself, to fully appreciate that there are ways to change our brain momentarily and create what are called critical periods during which our neuroplasticity is at its highest level. And therefore, we don't have this kind of open invitation for neuroplasticity. We need to, in many ways, we need to induce it, and we need to take advantage of that. And some entheogens, this is a term that is now commonly used for people who work with plant medicine, some of those really do open those critical periods and create enormous opportunity to rewire traumas, to rewire depression, to rewire addictions in a few sessions. I have witnessed this over the last 15 years, over 1,000 times. And so I needed that data as a scientist to really take this seriously, and I have, by merging what I have learned from neuroscience with what I have learned from the power of spiritual experiences.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, it's really cool. And I just have to say, looking at these non-ordinary states, as you have been discussing them, there are lots of ways to enter those. You've said that, and it is absolutely true. So, if somebody is not interested perhaps in a psychedelic experience, then there are lots of different ways that we can actually, well, the way that I look at it is actually get our ego to step aside, because our ego wants to control everything. And sometimes it does that by these bad behaviors because it's distracting us from the pain that we would be feeling otherwise. Sometimes it does it through habits and patterns or beliefs that allow us to kind of live our lives in a little space so that we don't get hurt. We're always trying to protect ourselves from getting hurt. That's what the egos are for. And therefore, the egos are not really that interested in consciousness from my perspective. And so if there's a moment even that we can allow that ego to step aside and be able to truly have an experience beyond the ego, then everything changes. And as you know, I had a spontaneous mystical experience many, many years ago that just completely changed everything for me. And perhaps I'll share a little bit more about that when we flip the roles here and you interview me for this podcast. But just to say that when we have an experience like that, again, everything changes and it opens us up to be able to learn about who we are in this lifetime, to learn what our calling is, what are our gifts, what do we have the capacity to do, what did we come here to do, perhaps you might say, because I know you have an interest in quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and I do as well. And what I understand is that if you believe in consciousness at all, then perhaps consciousness is pervasive in the universe, just as is suggested by quantum physics. And if that is the case, then perhaps we were consciousness before we came into these physical bodies in this world of form. And therefore, maybe we had some say in the planning of what we were going to do here. So once we show up here, then it's up to us to kind of inspect, our lives, to look and be self-reflective and figure out what is it that's happening for me and what am I here to do and how do I go about doing that. So maybe you can share some of those practical rituals that you have come up with that can give us an idea, give everybody an idea of how we can actually induce those non-ordinary states, as you have mentioned.
Of course. So I do not claim that I have a model that will completely revolutionize our understanding of consciousness. What I want it open to be is, I would say, almost a textbook for anyone seeking to have certainly different answers about struggling with stress, anxiety, depression, addiction, and trauma. And in that exploration, I really revealed the science of many of those modalities, like meditation, like prayer, but also being in nature, being present with your animals is, as mundane as it may appear, an extraordinarily powerful opportunity to suspend your ego, suspend this need to control all our experiences, and just be simply present and absorb the love that these animals want to give us, and their ability to just stay grounded in the present. Our mind is constantly, particularly today, trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future. And this chatter is extremely destructive, not just to our consciousness, but to our ability to self-heal many of those maladaptive behaviors. So I've identified 25 of those rituals. Many of them you will find are probably rituals that you have already in your own agenda. But first of all, understanding what it means to ritualize. What it means is to have regularity and a huge commitment to a particular practice that you know is going to nurture your ability to be more conscious and therefore more plastic.
And I just have to add, from a soul-centered perspective, obviously ritual, well, I say obviously, it is obvious to me, but ritual for me from a soul-centered perspective means something that we can do that is actually a bridge between our everyday ego self and that something bigger. So when you talk about these kinds of things like prayer and meditation and spending time in nature and with our animals, those are activities that can actually allow us, again, to get outside of that ego self and to be able to feel connected with something bigger or deeper. And that is the whole thing, isn't it? It's that sense of feeling connected to something that's bigger that gives us meaning in our lives. And then when we have struggles and challenges and all of those traumas and addictions and things that you were talking about, then we can put them in their place and we can start to relate to them in different ways because we have an understanding of why we have them and also what we can do about them. So I think this is really powerful. Now, I have read your book word for word, the whole thing from beginning to end. And so I just wonder if there's anything else that you would like to share with us about rituals. I know that you've broken those down into 3 categories, and it might be very interesting for our listeners to just know what those categories are and how to view those.
So when I became officially a neuroscientist, I was especially interested in understanding certain path of information processing. And it sounds really technical, but what I became very interested in is the layering of our brain. We don't have one physical brain. We really have 2 functional systems. One, which is called the primal brain, responsible for, all those behaviors and responses that ensure our survival. And of course, on the top of that, the more evolved part of our brain is called the rational brain, technically the cortex. And I thought that this was all I could really learn about the brain until, of course, I began to explore, particularly through my work with ayahuasca, and non-ordinary states of consciousness that clearly were not residing in the primal brain nor in the rational brain, but were emergent. And what I have come to believe, and it turns out that I think a lot of spiritual systems endorse that idea, and that is that the spiritual part of our experience is really generated above these 2 layers. And whether it lives in the brain or whether we're just being antennas and picking up the signal, it doesn't really matter. What matters is these spiritual states are actually real. And therefore, we have the ability to tap into that for what it means about our purpose, about our health, about our ability to connect to something that is far bigger than our little ego.
It's so powerful, isn't it? It's just really exciting to be on the forefront of this work. There's a lot of research that's going on out there now about consciousness, and there's a lot of reading material and documentaries and things that are starting to pop up everywhere. And your book is just such an amazing addition to all of these. As we wrap up here, what else would you like to add that you feel like is really important for the listeners to know?
I think the conclusion of my book is all about this notion of flow, this ability that we have once we engages those steps of higher consciousness, neuroplasticity, rewriting your stories, and so on. You really have the ability to enter into those states without thinking about them. And once you do, there is this really just magical, blissful state called flow, where everything is done without friction, without worries. And I have come to maximize the amount of time that I spend in flow. And I don't want to get out of it. It's just so precious to restore our peace, to restore our serenity, and to feed our soul with what it is designed to do, to be aware, to be conscious, and to be well.
Yeah, amazing work. I'm really excited to see where all of this is going to go. And of course, as I have mentioned, this is really the core of our work on this whole soul, cosmos, and consciousness series, to really continue to explore these themes and these ideas so that everyone has access to what we're looking at and researching and exploring, because it's just, again, so powerful. It really literally is changing people's lives. So if you are interested in consciousness, I invite everybody who's listening to this to check out our entire Soul, Cosmos, and Consciousness Soul feed. And that is located on the menu of the website for the Institute for Soul-Centered Psychology and Coaching. You can find that at instituteforsoulcentered.com. And also, I just invite you to check out our free webinars. We're doing a free webinar on the final Friday of every month. And so you can look at that and find that information on that Soul feed as well.
Last note, as you know, as a researcher, I like assessments, and therefore I have created assessments, ways to benchmark, for instance, your level of stress and anxiety, as well as a test for the Enneagram. And so I'll make sure we can post this. They're free assessments, and they really are beginning that process of investigating your personality, your coping mechanisms, and that's kind of the first step of the journey for greater consciousness and flow.
You know, when Socrates said, know thyself, I think this is exactly what he was referring to. So great tools. Thank you for offering those. And thank you so much for talking with me today, Christophe. I look forward to much more of this to come.
Thank you.